that there are different ways of looking at America's 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. You can look at that founding document and you can say in 1776, the founders wrote something that really was revolutionary at the time, and this was a time of revolution against British ownership of the 13 American colonies, to say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, justice and the pursuit of happiness. And that, of course, was a statement which was so blind to the realities of slavery in the United States, which continued for another almost 80 years, that when it was talking about all men being created equal, it was only talking about white men. It was talking about white men who were entitled to be self-governing, to become president of the new United States. It was an argument against the divine right of kings, that God had chosen royalty to preside over ordinary people. That's what that was about. It now seems very, very hypocritical because, of course, this was that plus the American Constitution in the following decade now seems like a terribly sort of racist document that had this massive blind spot that you had about 95% of the population was holding 5% of the population in chains, working in their mills and their cotton fields. So some people choose to just gloss over all of that and say, but America's great. Look at the flag, look at the hot dog eating competitions, look at the planes and the fireworks and everything else. And others saying, it's actually a time to reflect upon the fundamental contradictions in the United States. Contradictions which, set aside, also America became this beacon of liberty, of freedom, and of human beings, increasingly, not just white men, but all sorts of men and women, are now able to self-govern. It's still a highly imperfect system, but there are those that would argue, well, you really do need to understand all of those nuances and complexities to know what you are celebrating. Otherwise, you're just blindly waving a flag and not really knowing what it represents.
This, the Declaration of Independence, it was aspirational, shall we say. And yes, you say it just denied the reality of the situation of America at the time. But it was aspirational. It does seem that aspiration seems to have fallen through right through America till today. But polls are suggesting that many Americans are unhappy with the state of the country. Does that mean the American dream has really failed?
You're right, Fauzia, to say that one of the driving engines of the United States, from even before the time of independence from Great Britain in the 1770s, 1780s, it was formalised, is this notion that America is always perfecting itself. It has not yet reached perfection, but it is striving to become a more perfect union. It has allowed freedom and aspiration to drive it. Innovation has been the engine at the heart of America, and the United States has given the world incredible innovations, not just in the sort of Republican model of government and democracy that was exported around the world, but in the way that it industrialised, it modernised, it innovated, it developed things from, the cotton gin to the microchip and the microprocessor. It is continuing to do things, leading the world still in areas like AI. Anyone who rules out the United States, writes them off, is likely to be contradicted. That being said, a huge number of the 380 million Americans do not get the benefits of that prosperity. They do not get the ability to own a home, to have health care, to send their children to school and to college, to have lives as long as people in Australia or in Western Europe. They don't have those advantages despite being in the richest, most powerful nation on earth. So yes, you're right. A lot of Americans, certainly since the global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, feel as though they're not a part of the American dream. And if you look at the measures of optimism about the future now compared to 50 years ago at the time of the bicentennial in 1976, even though in 1976 they'd lost the war in Vietnam, Richard Nixon had been forced to resign over Watergate, they'd had assassinations, civil strife, America had been through the ringer in the previous 15 years leading up to 1976, and yet in 1976 Americans were feeling good. It was a bipartisan bicentennial. This year, in the semi-quincentennial, well, everything that's happening in Washington has literally been taken over by Donald Trump. What's going to happen in the next couple of hours with his speech and the fireworks display is something that his organisation, Freedom 250, has taken over from the previous organising committee, which was bipartisan, which was America 250. He's making money out of this as well as making it all about him. So a lot of Americans, about 75 million who voted against Donald Trump in 2024, they certainly do not see themselves reflected in what's happening in Washington. But that's not to say they're not getting into the spirit of things, because Americans, left-wing, right-wing, apolitical, patriotism is something that, even though it is politicised and it is often appropriated by the likes of Donald Trump, it is still something that people celebrate. Because if you're living in California, you might be in a quite progressive community there, you'll be celebrating with your friends on the lawn watching a rock concert right now. You won't be necessarily on the streets of Washington, DC, wearing your Make America Great hat.
Yeah.
Different Americans are celebrating this in different ways.
Yeah. You touched on it a bit there with the economics, John, but when you look at America's position on the global stage throughout those 250 years and how it's evolved, and in recent years, those traditional allies, the relationships, straining, how is that changing things in terms of who America is for the world?
America always had this sense of its manifest destiny, and that it had a right to, at first, to push westward and to take lands that had been part of Mexico and had been still part of the British colonial possessions, French possessions down in Louisiana. There was this sense of America expanding, and that expansion happened largely before the 1850s. It wasn't until after the Civil War in the 1860s, in the 2 decades that followed, America's economy expanded, partly through the industrialisation and the railways that were built during that period of conflict, but it became the world's biggest economy in the 1890s. It wasn't until the 1920s, after the First World War had wreaked such havoc on the British Empire, and obviously the Germans and the Russians as well, that America became the world's biggest military. So it had this 30-year period of economic dominance before it became this militarily dominant force, which of course continued after the Second World War and the Cold War. We're now getting this sense of awareness in the United States that China's a bit like us. They're becoming economically very powerful and they're militarising in the same way. They're extending their reach, just in the way that America did as well, whether it's through colonial possessions, whether it's through exporting their ideological basis for government and running their own economy. So America kind of has this interesting relationship in this really bipolar world now, even though Russia is still perhaps the most immediate strategic threat to American military interests. China is this rising power. So America is tremendously threatened by that, probably in a way that it was never even by the Soviet Union in the post-World War II period. So Americans are now reconciling the fact that they aren't somehow gifted by God with unique powers to innovate and that their system of government isn't the only way to run a government. We've seen it under Donald Trump, in many ways, a more Chinese style of authoritarianism creeping into the way that he's politicised the judiciary and other branches of government. So America is at an interesting inflection point, trying to decide, what does it become next? Does it become a more sophisticated, sort of middle-aged power like France and Great Britain? Does it fight against the dying of the light? It's still got a big population, it's still got a massive economy and a massive military. Does it try and flex those muscles to retain its place in the world? Are they going to see China come up against demographic barriers just as Japan did in the 1990s and suddenly go, they look like they were going to knock us off our perch, but you know what, they're all getting old now and they're stopping working and their economy's fading away as well. So America is soul-searching to an extent and uncertain to its future, and that's where those measures of optimism are really interesting. The levels of people now talking about being confident in the future, around 20%, as opposed to 50% 50 years ago. Yeah. So Americans are now looking at the next 50 years and they don't really know what the 300th birthday is going to look like.
Yeah. You know, I just want to stay with the issue of America's relationship with the rest of the world. And there was a time where America was very eager to export, the American liberty, freedom, and the idea of democracy. And then we think about, the Iran war, we think about Afghanistan as well. These were wars that America was bogged down for quite some time. And they did try to export the American democracy, which didn't quite work. Do Americans and the rest of the world still believe in the American idea of democracy, given, as you said, a majority of them are not actually benefiting from that system?
a lot of Americans really, their feelings towards their government depends on who's president at the time, who's got the majority in Congress at the time. So right now, Republicans feel as though things are working really well. They feel as though things were terrible under Joe Biden, things were terrible under Barack Obama, and things are now great again. They don't necessarily look at particular policies. They don't even think of it in a nuanced way. It's just how they feel. Is their side winning? So it's a very parochial, if not patriotic, feeling. Democrats, of course, are largely the same. When Donald Trump was tossed out the first time, Joe Biden became president, a lot of Democrats felt better. They thought the system is working. Even though they lost rights, such as a woman's right to choose to have an abortion under a Supreme Court ruling that happened because of Trump-appointed justices, but under Joe Biden's presidency, they still felt as though our side is more or less in control. Progress is still happening in a way that we want. Conservatives felt less comfortable at that point. There is this inevitable cycle in the United States, and it ultimately comes down to, do we feel as though we're winning or not? The big thing this year, I think this is very different to 1976, 1926 as well, is that right now this is being made by Donald Trump about Donald Trump. And so half of the country really don't feel invested in it. And in fact, they feel as though if they put on an American flag T-shirt, they might be seen as being a Trump supporter if they're not. So this is it's going to be interesting to see what Donald Trump's speech is like. His posts on social media for the last week have been anything but unifying. Yeah. He is still trolling what he's referring to as Democrats and others, and making similar comments to J.D. Vance, anticipating criticisms that haven't yet happened, and making this a straw man argument. So whether President Trump reaches for unity on this day, or whether he continues, much as he does in all of his political rallies, where he's setting up these diametric sort of arguments, well, it'll be interesting to see. It'll also be interesting to see whether the speech can go ahead because of the storms that are hitting Washington, D.C., whether the 40-minute firework display is going to go ahead because of the extreme heat and the windy weather conditions. We know wind can cancel fireworks displays. So this hasn't gone that well for Donald Trump in Washington, with the National State Fair being a bit of a fizzer, the extreme heat keeping people away, and the general partisanship that has turned a few people off.